Montana Territory, October 1881. While her neighbors stacked cord after cord of split pine against their cabin walls, preparing for the brutal winter everyone knew was coming, Eleanor Pritchard was on her knees in the dirt with a spade, digging a trench around the perimeter of her small log home. Passers-by slowed their wagons. A few laughed. Most shook their heads. What they didn't know, what she barely understood herself at the time, was that this odd-looking ditch would become the difference between warmth and freezing, between survival and desperation, between burning through precious fuel and sleeping through the night without waking to stoke the fire. By February, when temperatures dropped so low that iron tools snapped in half and breath froze mid-air, Eleanor's cabin floor stayed warm enough to walk barefoot. Her neighbors' floors? Coated in frost. Their children slept in layers near the stove. Hers played on the floorboards in wool socks. Today, you're going to see exactly what she understood about ground heat loss that even experienced builders missed. The numbers are going to shock you. The simplicity is going to make you rethink everything you know about insulation. But before we go further, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week, I bring you one real frontier technique that worked when lives depended on it. Comment below and tell me, where are you watching from? I want to know. Let's dig into this story. Eleanor Pritchard wasn't trying to revolutionize cabin construction. She was trying to fix a problem that had plagued her since she'd arrived in Montana Territory 2 years earlier, after her husband died of pneumonia during their first winter. She was a practical woman. Her father had been a stonemason back in Pennsylvania, and she'd grown up watching him build root cellars that stayed cool in summer and never froze solid in winter. She understood foundations. She understood drainage. And she understood that her cabin, like most in the valley, had been built the standard way. Logs directly on stone piers, with maybe 6 to 8 inches of clearance beneath the floor joists. That gap was supposed to ventilate moisture and keep the wood from rotting. In theory, it worked. In practice, it turned the crawl space into a wind tunnel that sucked warmth straight through the floorboards. Every morning that first winter, Eleanor woke to ice crystals spreading across the inside of her floor planks. Her children, 2 girls, ages 7 and 9, refused to step out of bed without wrapping their feet in rags first. The cold radiated up from below like the cabin was built over a frozen pond. She burned wood constantly, an entire cord every 10 days, just to keep the main room tolerable. And still, the floor stayed cold as stone. By autumn of 1881, Eleanor had had enough. Her initial plan wasn't about insulation. She noticed that during spring melt, water pooled under the cabin, soaking into the dirt and making the crawl space damp for weeks. She figured if she dug a shallow trench around the perimeter, like the drainage ditches her father used to dig around root cellars, she could divert runoff and keep the ground beneath the cabin drier. So she started digging, 18 inches deep, 12 inches wide, all the way around the cabin's base, about 6 inches out from the stone piers. And then, almost as an afterthought, because she had leftover straw from the barn and nowhere to store it, she started filling the trench. Loose straw, dry wood chips from split kindling, a layer of charcoal, dust from a forge. Anything dry and fibrous that wouldn't compact or rot quickly. She didn't call it thermal insulation. She called it keeping the damp out. Her neighbors called it something else entirely. Picture this: a woman alone, kneeling in the dirt with a hand spade, carving a narrow ditch around her entire cabin. The trench averaged 18 inches deep, deep enough to hit the frost line that would form by December. It ran 12 inches wide, clean-edged, following the cabin's perimeter about 6 inches from the foundation piers. She worked in sections. Dig 4 feet, clear the soil, move on. The dirt she removed, she piled into a low berm on the outer edge of the trench, creating a slight slope away from the cabin. Drainage, she thought. Keep the spring melt flowing away. Once a section was dug, she filled it in layers. First, a base of fist-sized river stones for drainage. Then a thick layer of dry straw, the kind that had been sitting in the barn loft all summer, brittle and golden. Over that, wood shavings and sawdust from the lumber mill where she traded for planks. Then more straw. Then a thin layer of charcoal dust, which she'd saved from cleaning out the fire pit. She tamped it down lightly, but not too much. The idea, she thought, was to keep it loose enough to let moisture drain, but dense enough to stay in place. Finally, she covered the trench with old split shakes, thin wooden shingles she'd pulled off the barn roof during repairs. The shakes kept rain from soaking the fill and created a small air gap between the insulation and the ground surface. What Eleanor had accidentally built was a thermal break. The trench created a buffer zone between the frozen ground outside and the crawl space beneath her cabin. The layered, fibrous materials, straw, sawdust, charcoal, trapped air in thousands of tiny pockets. Air doesn't conduct heat well. That's the principle. The ground outside the trench could freeze solid, but the cold had to travel through 18 inches of low-density, air-filled insulation before it could reach the underside of her floor. It also interrupted convective airflow. Before the trench, wind would sweep across the open ground, dive under the cabin, and pull heat straight through the floorboards. Now, the wind hit a barrier. The air beneath the cabin became still. Stillness means warmth. To anyone watching, it looked like she was burying garbage around her house. It looked improvised, ugly, and pointless. One neighbor, a man named Horace Madden, a carpenter who'd built half the cabins in the valley, stopped his wagon one afternoon and called out to her. "Eleanor, what in God's name are you doing to that house?" She wiped her hands on her apron, keeping it dry. He squinted at the trench, shook his head. "You're making a rot trap. All that straw's going to draw mice, rats, maybe even skunks. Come spring, you'll have a mess of damp wood and vermin nesting right up against your foundation. Mark my words." She didn't argue. She just kept filling the trench. Others were less polite. A few women at the general store whispered that Eleanor was losing her sense, that grief had made her strange. A rancher passing through town remarked that it looked like she was digging a grave around her own house, and maybe that's what she wants. No one thought it would work. Most thought it was a waste of time and materials. A few thought it was outright foolish, an act of desperation by a widow who didn't know better. But Eleanor had grown up watching her father insulate root cellars with straw bales and sawdust. She'd seen how those cellars stayed cool in summer and never froze in winter, even when the ground outside turned to iron. She didn't know the physics. She just knew it worked. So she kept digging and filling and covering. By the time the first snow fell in early November, the trench was complete. From a distance, it was barely visible. Just a low ring of wooden shakes circling the cabin's base, like a strange decorative border. Up close, if you knelt down and looked, you could see the layers. Straw, sawdust, charcoal, river stones at the bottom. It didn't look like genius. It looked like a woman making do with scraps. The criticism wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, dismissive, the kind of skepticism that comes with a smirk and a shrug. Horace Madden, the carpenter, mentioned it at the lumber mill one afternoon in November. Eleanor Pritchard's gone and dug a moat around her cabin, filled it with barn sweepings, and called it an improvement. A few men laughed. One asked if she was planning to fill it with water and raise ducks. Another man, a logger named Cyrus Webb, shook his head. Winter's going to wash all that loose fill right out. She'll have a muddy ditch by March and a rotten sill by June. It wasn't malicious. It was just doubt. The kind that comes from seeing someone do something outside the normal pattern. Cabins in Montana Territory were built a certain way. Logs on piers, clearance underneath, stack your firewood, burn it hard, survive. That was the method. Deviating from it seemed pointless at best, risky at worst. At the general store, one of the older women, a homesteader's wife named Iris Colton, asked Eleanor directly, "Honey, what are you expecting that trench to do? You worried about flooding?" Eleanor measured out a length of muslin fabric, folding it carefully. "I'm worried about cold floors." Iris blinked. "Cold floors? Well, every cabin's got cold floors. You burn more wood. That's how you fix it. I don't have more wood to burn." Iris softened a little. "Well, I suppose we all make do how we can." It was a polite way of saying, "That's not going to help, but bless your heart for trying." Even Eleanor's closest neighbor, a kind woman named Beatrice Harmon, who lived a quarter-mile down the valley, couldn't hide her confusion. She stopped by one afternoon with a loaf of bread and found Eleanor tamping down the last section of the trench. "Eleanor, I've been meaning to ask, what exactly is this for?" Eleanor straightened, brushing dirt from her skirt. Keeps the ground cold from getting under the cabin. Beatrice looked at the trench, then at Eleanor, then back at the trench. I see. She didn't see, but she was too polite to say so. The truth was, no one in the valley had ever tried anything like it. Insulation was for walls, if you had the money for it. Newspaper, clay and straw chinking, maybe a layer of sod on the roof. The idea of insulating the ground around a cabin? It seemed backward, unnecessary, a solution to a problem that didn't exist. And so Eleanor finished her trench in relative silence. No one stopped her. No one helped her. They just watched and waited. Horace Madden made one final comment in late November after the first hard freeze. He was delivering planks to a nearby homestead and passed Eleanor's cabin on the way. He saw the trench, still intact, shakes still in place, no signs of washout or collapse. He muttered to his apprentice, "Give it till January. That'll be a frozen mess, just like I said." The apprentice nodded. Winter was coming, and winter, they believed, would prove them right. December 1881 started cold. By the second week, it was colder than most settlers had seen in 5 years. By Christmas, it was colder than anyone could remember. The thermometer outside the general store read 12 degrees Fahrenheit on December 20th. By December 28th, it had dropped to -8. On January 3rd, 1882, it hit -22, and it stayed there. For 3 straight weeks, daytime temperatures never climbed above zero. Nights dropped to -30, sometimes lower. The kind of cold that makes trees crack like gunshots. The kind that turns your breath into ice clouds that fall to the ground. The kind that kills livestock in their stalls if you're not careful. The settlers in the valley had prepared. They'd stacked firewood. They'd chinked every gap in their walls. They'd hung blankets over windows and doors. They burned fires day and night, feeding their stoves and hearths in shifts, waking every few hours to keep the flames alive. But the cold didn't care. In Horace Madden's cabin, the floor near the door developed a thin sheet of ice every morning. His wife swept it away with a broom, but came back by noon. Their children slept in a pile near the stove, layered in quilts and wool blankets, refusing to move more than a few feet from the heat. Cyrus Webb, the logger, burned through 2 full cords of wood in the first 10 days of January. His floor stayed cold enough that water left in a cup overnight would skim over with ice. He stuffed rags into the gaps between the floorboards, trying to block the drafts rising from below, but it barely helped. Beatrice Harmon's husband built a second fire, one in the hearth, one in a small sheet metal stove near the back wall, but even that couldn't keep the floor warm. Frost crept along the baseboards. The air 6 inches above the floor was noticeably colder than the air at chest height. Walking barefoot was unthinkable. Across the valley, it was the same story. Families huddled. Fires roared. Wood piles shrank. And still, the cold pressed in from below, stealing warmth faster than the stoves could replace it. By mid-January, people started comparing notes. How much were you burning? How cold was your floor? Did you try stuffing the crawl space? Did you bank snow against the foundation? Everyone had tried something. Nothing worked well. And then someone, Iris Colton, the woman from the general store, mentioned Eleanor Pritchard. "I haven't seen her hauling wood in over a week," Iris said one afternoon, standing by the stove inside the store. "You think she's all right out there?" Horace Madden frowned. "She's probably burning through her supply faster than she can split it. Widow with 2 kids, trying to keep up? I'd be surprised if she makes it to February without running out." But Beatrice Harmon, who lived closest to Eleanor, shook her head slowly. "I walked past her place 2 days ago. Smoke from the chimney, sure, but not constant, not like ours. And I saw her girls outside without coats for a few minutes, just playing near the door." Iris blinked. "In this cold?" Beatrice nodded. "I thought it was strange." Horace crossed his arms. "Maybe she's just tougher than most." No one said it out loud, but the question hung in the air. How is she staying warm? Stay with me, because what happens next silenced every single critic. The numbers, the actual measurable difference, are going to prove that sometimes the crazy solution is the one that saves your life. The valley was about to learn a lesson in thermal physics, and Eleanor Pritchard was about to become the most visited woman in Montana territory. The truth came out in pieces. Small observations that didn't make sense at first until someone put them all together. Beatrice Harmon was the first to knock on Eleanor's door. It was January 18th, 1882. The temperature had been below zero for 16 straight days. Beatrice had walked a quarter mile through knee-deep snow, wrapped in 3 layers of wool, to check on her neighbor. When Eleanor opened the door, Beatrice felt it immediately. A wall of warmth. Not just warmth, dry warmth. The kind that doesn't sting your face when you step inside from the cold. The kind that makes you want to pull off your gloves and coat right away. Beatrice stepped into the main room and stopped. Eleanor's 2 daughters were sitting on the floor, not near the stove, but in the middle of the room, playing with wooden dolls. Barefoot, in cotton dresses. Beatrice stared. Eleanor, your floor. Eleanor smiled. I know. Beatrice knelt down and pressed her palm flat against the floorboards. They weren't warm, exactly, but they weren't cold either. They were neutral, maybe 55, 60 degrees. Warmer than any cabin floor she'd felt all winter. Ow! Beatrice whispered. Eleanor gestured toward the fire. A small, steady blaze in the hearth. Not roaring, not stoked to capacity. Just burning. I feed it 3 times a day. Sometimes 4. That's it. Beatrice did the math in her head. Her husband was feeding their stove every 2 hours, around the clock. They were burning wood faster than they could split it, and their floor was still freezing. The trench, Beatrice said slowly. Eleanor nodded. The trench. By the next afternoon, Horace Madden was standing in Eleanor's cabin with a small thermometer he'd borrowed from the general store. He'd insisted on taking measurements himself. He didn't believe Beatrice's report. Couldn't believe it. He placed the thermometer on Eleanor's floor, 6 feet from the hearth. Waited 5 minutes. Checked it. 58 degrees Fahrenheit. He walked outside, brushed snow off his own cabin's porch, went inside, and measured his floor in the same spot, 6 feet from his stove. 34 degrees. 2 degrees above freezing. He stood there, staring at the thermometer, trying to make sense of it. His stove was bigger. His fire was hotter. He was burning twice as much wood. And his floor was 24 degrees colder. He walked back to Eleanor's cabin and asked her to explain it again. The trench, the straw, the sawdust, the drainage, the air gap. She explained it the same way she had before. Simple, practical, no science, just observation. Horace looked at the floor, looked at the girls playing, looked at the small fire in the hearth. Then he looked at Eleanor. I told you it wouldn't work, he said quietly. I know, I was wrong. Eleanor didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just nodded. It's all right. I wasn't sure myself. Over the next 2 weeks, word spread through the valley like a wildfire. People came to see for themselves. They brought thermometers. They measured Eleanor's floor, measured their own, and walked away shaking their heads. Cyrus Webb, the logger, measured a 20-degree difference between Eleanor's cabin and his own. Iris Colton brought her husband, a man who'd built cabins in Wyoming and Colorado, and thought he'd seen every trick there was. He measured Eleanor's crawl space temperature, 42 degrees, even though the ground outside was frozen solid at 18 inches deep. It's a thermal break, he muttered, almost to himself. The trench stops the frost from reaching the foundation, keeps the air underneath from freezing. Simple as hell. Horace Madden went home that night and started digging. He didn't wait for spring. He didn't wait for the ground to thaw. He used a pickaxe to break through the frozen topsoil, then a spade to clear out the trench. 18 inches deep, just like Eleanor's. 12 inches wide. He filled it with whatever he had, straw from the barn, wood shavings from his shop, a layer of old burlap sack stuffed with sawdust. It wasn't as clean as Eleanor's. It wasn't as carefully layered. But it worked. Within a week, his floor temperature climbed from 34 degrees to 48. His family stopped sleeping in a pile near the stove. His wood consumption dropped by a third. By late February, 11 other families in the valley had dug trenches around their cabins. Some used straw and sawdust like Eleanor. Others tried variations, corn husks, dried moss, even packed snow covered with planks to create an insulated barrier. The methods varied, but the principle was the same. Stop the ground cold from stealing heat through the floor. The results were measurable, consistent, undeniable. Families who added the trench reported floor temperature increases of 15 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood consumption dropped by 30 to 40%. Fires could be banked overnight without the cabin freezing by morning. Children slept in their own beds instead of huddled near the stove. One family, a young couple named the Prices, who'd only been in Montana for 6 months, said the trench saved their lives. They'd been down to their last half-cord of wood in mid-January, rationing it carefully, trying to make it a spring. After digging the trench and insulating it with straw, they stretched that half-cord for another 5 weeks. When the thaw finally came in early March, they still had wood left. Eleanor never charged anyone for advice. She showed them her trench, explained the layers, answered questions. Some people tried to pay her, offered her firewood, smoked meat, sacks of flour. She turned them all down. I didn't invent it, she said. My father used to insulate root cellars the same way. I just tried it on a cabin. But the community knew better. Eleanor had taken an old idea, ground insulation for food storage, and adapted it to a new problem. She'd tested it when no one else would, and she'd proven it worked when it mattered most. By the winter of 1883, more than half the cabins within 30 miles of Eleanor's homestead had some form of perimeter insulation. Trenches, mostly. A few families built short stone walls around their foundations and packed the gap with straw. Others buried old logs horizontally around the cabin's base and filled the space with sawdust and moss. The techniques varied, but the lesson was universal. The ground beneath your cabin is a massive heat sink. If you don't stop the cold from rising through the floor, you'll burn twice as much wood and stay half as warm. It wasn't a miracle. It was physics, thermal mass, conduction, convection. The same principles Eleanor's father had used to keep potatoes from freezing in a Pennsylvania root cellar. And it worked because someone was willing to try something that looked foolish. Here's the thing most people don't realize. Traditional building methods aren't tradition because they're old. They're tradition because they solved real problems with limited resources. Eleanor didn't have fiberglass insulation or vapor barriers or foam board. She had straw, sawdust, stones, and a memory of her father kneeling in the dirt, building something that would outlast him. The cabins with trenches stayed warmer. The families with trenches stayed healthier. The children with warm floors grew up stronger because they weren't burning calories just to stay warm at night. And Eleanor? She lived in that cabin for another 23 years, raised her daughters, remarried eventually. When she finally moved to town in 1904, the new owners kept the trench exactly as she'd built it. They added to it over the years, more insulation, better drainage, a stone cap to keep animals out, but the core design stayed the same. Because it worked. That's the lesson. Not everything old is obsolete. Not everything simple is stupid. And sometimes, the person everyone laughs at is the only one paying attention to what actually matters. Eleanor Pritchard didn't set out to prove anyone wrong. She set out to keep her children warm. The fact that she revolutionized cold climate building in her corner of Montana, that was just a side effect of doing what worked. So here's my question for you. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Drop a comment below. I want to hear your stories. I want to know if you've ever tried something simple that everyone said wouldn't work, and then it did. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Every week, I bring you one real technique from the frontier that worked when lives were on the line. No fluff, no myths, just practical wisdom that stood the test of time. Because the past has a lot to teach us. We just have to be willing to dig for it. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.